All right.
Okay. Ask me anything.
With us this afternoon is Frank Robinson. I'm Rusty Hevelin. We're at the Convention Center in Orlando, Florida at the 50th World Science Fiction Convention this afternoon. We're going to talk with Frank about some of the early history of the science fiction field, both fan and pro. I'd like to hit you early on with what got you started with an interest in science fiction per se.
The usual stuff. I read all the fairy tale books. I read H.G. Wells. I read Jules Verne. Then I had a brother who was into the pulp magazines. He read sports stories magazines, and he would occasionally read Argosy and occasionally read Blue Book if they had a sports story in it. So one day he gave me a quarter to go to the second-hand store, and I picked up a couple of issues of Astounding instead, which looked a hell of a lot more interesting than sports stories. So he pounded me once or twice and vowed as how I should never do that again, but I continued reading science fiction, and he eventually gave up on sports stories.
How long was it before you got involved in any kind of fannish activities, what we call fannish activities?
I wrote a letter or two, I think it was in 41. I went up to see Ray Palmer and sold him an idea for a cartoon, for which he paid $5.
And this was before you had any fannish activity
Yeah.
at all? Uh-huh.
And then I had a letter in Comet, the F.O. entry main Comet, and one that I had handwritten. I didn't have a typewriter. And they pieced it all out, got the address wrong and my name wrong, but it was undeniably me. And then, God, I think, who in the hell did I wander into first? I forget whether it was no, it was Charlie McNutt, otherwise known as Charles Beaumont.
Yeah, right.
And we became members of the Windy City Vampires, this was after the big breakup after the second Worldcon, after Chi-Con won. And Neil DeJack and Howard Funk and Charlie and myself were members, and then later Walt Leacher. And Walt worked in a restaurant hash house beneath the Howard Street L. Up on Howard
Walt
Street.
moved to Chicago from...
Yeah, from Joliet. And it was through Walt that eventually I met Tucker, and then through Tucker, the Slan Shack people, et cetera, et cetera. But I had, by this time it was 42, 43, and I and Echo Connor picked up Fan News Card Weekly from Tuck, and ran it until I was drafted in 43, I guess it was.
You were in the Navy. You were stationed in Chicago throughout the whole thing?
No, I was in Chicago going to electronic technician school, then got shipped out to the West Coast and subsequently over to Japan, and then back. But I spent most of my time in Chicago at Navy Pier studying electronics.
What, other than the fan news card, which you carried on very nobly during the war years when things sort of fell to pieces, were you involved in any other kind of fan writing and publishing?
Yeah, I had. I became oddly enough, for one issue of Les Zombies, I became a fan artist, and did the only 6-color cover that ever appeared in a fan magazine, certainly at the time. And it's down in the history of fanzines.
Oh, great.
That one with the little fish blowing progressively bigger bubbles.
Bigger bubbles, right.
And I cut the mats and had a manual spray gun, Carter spray gun, and sprayed it all.
Everything was manual in those days.
Oh boy, yeah. I even, for Fan News Card, I made a mimeograph.
Yes,
to try and mimeograph
you
it.
might explain that, because some people can scarcely remember what a mimeograph was, and the story is about you were not the only one who did this, but how did you go about reinventing the mimeograph?
Reinventing the mimeograph. Well, mimeographs per se cost money, even secondhand.
That's right.
And what I invented was essentially a super roller blotter, where you do the stencil and then you get a pad loaded with ink and you roll it around this drum and roll the stencil around. Go ahead and sort of like a blotter.
Enlarged roll stamp
Yeah,
pad.
yeah, right,
Yeah.
exactly.
And did you have to ink it each time, or that was an actual pad underneath the stencil?
That was an actual pad underneath the stencil. I could barely get out 100 copies, believe me.
Right. Okay. Well, now you got into the small group during the war. What kind of a transition was involved for you in and out of the service and back into fandom?
Well, there's a couple of things you left out here, which we
Fill 'em
should
in.
cover. I graduated from high school prior to getting drafted, of course, in, when the hell was it, 43, I guess it was. And
That makes you
the
younger
first,
than me, of course.
not much. First job I got was as a copy boy for INS. The second job was as an office boy for Ziff Davis.
Zip,
And in the latter days of the news card, when it was a photo offset, I was working both at INS and at Ziff Davis.
Oh,
And it was at Ziff Davis that I met Bob Block. And I'd met Palmer before, but I met Block and some of the other writers came around. Plus, of course, I was going to Slant Shack and meeting people up there, too.
well, since we went back to fill that in, let's go back and fill out something else, or flesh out something else. You said that you went in and sold this idea for a cartoon to Ray Palmer.
Yeah.
Flesh that out a little bit. What kind of an experience was it? Were you one of these awestruck fans, or did it just seem to you as something to do?
No, I was an awestruck fan, but a little bit of a history there. I'd never met Palmer. I had no idea that Palmer was really badly hunchbacked. And I had a stepfather. My stepfather was also hunchbacked,
Oh,
although not as bad as Ray was. But going in and meeting Ray, you meet this little guy barely 5 feet tall,
Yeah.
and that was quite a shocker. I was not quite prepared for that. I'd seen no photographs. I knew nothing. But I was, of course, awed by the offices and the paintings on the wall and all of that. Later on, when I worked there, I became good friends with Howard Brown, who ran the mystery pulps, and developed quite a taste for Chandler and people like that, partly through Howard's influence.
well, very few fans or pros had the opportunity that you had at that kind of an age to get involved on the professional side and really see sort of the inside works.
Hell, I was just shuffling mail at the same time Freddie Pohl was actually editing a magazine.
Yes, that's right.
And that's,
But also, on the record from various books and so forth, we've gotten pictures of how things were in New York City.
Yeah.
But you were working in a different milieu out there with Ziff Davis, because Ziff Davis approached everything differently than most of the New York publishers did. And it might be good in terms of history to just fill in a little bit of the kind of things you did and the kind of context in which you did them.
Well, the office boy job was the standard office boy job. So you deliver the mail, etc. I also fleshed out my collection of Amazing and Fantastic, since I ran the mail room as well, and got away with a complete file of the official bound set of amazing stories going back to Gernsback years. The only time in my life I could have been accused of theft, but the temptation was far too great. Ziff Davis was a very professional magazine outfit, and Palmer was well aware that he was editing essentially two juvenile magazines. This used to irk Brown, because Brown, in putting out Mammoth Detective and Mammoth Mystery, aimed for an upscale pulp market. Later on, when Brown got to be the big cheese, and he upgraded the digest immediately to more mature stuff.
That's right.
But Ray put various authors on a draw. That is, he would guarantee to buy, say, 30,000 words of fiction a month. No rejection, no turn down. And Chet Geyer, O'Brien, I forget his, David Wright O'Brien, and Bill Hamlin, and some of the others were on a draw for him. And their work was not very good, but it didn't have to be good.
Yeah, for the audience, sure.
Right. Ray would occasionally buy a story by Ray Bradbury, somebody like that, but he never lost sight of the fact that this was juvenile science fiction.
He was guaranteeing purchase from these people. Were you ever aware of any of them, and you don't have to name names unless it's all right, but were you ever aware of any of them being stopped from that draw because of the quality of the sort of thing that they turned in?
Not to my knowledge.
So in other words, it worked for him.
Yeah. Ray I have a lot of respect for because of what he accomplished in life despite his own physical handicap. In many respects, he was a very nice man. In some respects, he was not a very nice man. And Leroy Yerkser was one of the guys on draw. And Ray held up the Yerkser account for a long time. For what reason, I don't know. But Leroy, who lived on a farm up in Michigan and was unable to do farming activity because of a heart condition, eventually died of that heart condition. And it was then that Bill Hamlin went in to see Ray and demanded that Ray pay up on the books. And because he had Leroy left a widow, Frances, who later on married Bill Hamlin, and she had a couple of kids. And Ray wrote out a check for some thousands of dollars, which was a lot of money back then.
This was back due money, which he'd held up on Leroy.
Yeah.
Oh. Those are things that sometimes don't get written into the history books.
Well, Ray was. This is not dirty linen. You have to understand. This is a guy who was at the bottom of the pile for a long, long time.
Right.
And Ray used to have a weekly poker game at which, I might add, they regularly fleeced the office boy, namely me. But Ray was not above cheating at poker, and doing so blatantly and daring the writers to catch him at it. And another time, he would sit, slightly sloshed, I guess, and say, I bought you for $49, I bought you for $54, and he would read off the first checks that they got for a short story. So it was, as I say, a man who had been at the bottom of the pile who was now at the top, and he was not above enjoying his position.
Well, he'd grown from a position of personal insecurity, which had built in some insecurity in him, which was probably no longer, not gone. It was still felt, right, even though he was in this higher position, which is not an uncommon thing. How long did it take you before you got the writing bug yourself?
I think I always wanted to write, but working for Ziff Davis, when I was in the Navy and stationed in Chicago, I used to go up and see Bill Hamlin and Chet Geyer, who had writing offices up in the North Side. And it struck me this was completely a glamour job. And there was
They didn't
never
write at home. They had a rented office.
they rented an office, you know, with a filing cabinet and a busted down couch. They could have been a couple of private eyes, for
Right,
God's
yeah.
sakes. But I never wanted to be anything else. I mean, this was it. I went to college and took a degree in physics, but went back into the Navy when I got out. I went to journalism school and immediately became a journalist. But my fiction writing, by and large, was done while I was in service and after I graduated from college in 1950. I sold my first short story while I was in college.
Oh, I see.
But when I came out with a degree in journalism, it was a long time.
Well, you said you went right into journalism after
Yeah.
you got your degree. You might fill that in for us a little bit.
I got out of the Navy. I went to college, took a degree, went back into the Navy. I was called back for the Korean War, and more GI Bill. So when I got out, I took a master's in journalism, and then went to work for a Sunday supplement called Family Weekly, which I think is still published.
Still published, yeah.
And after that, I went to work at Science Digest. And I was interviewed at the Digest by Fritz Leibert. And when I went to work, Fritz was gone. Fritz had interviewed his own replacement.
So it was touch and go as far as the field is concerned for you for a while.
Yeah.
When you were at Family Weekly, what tasks did you get involved in there?
General editorial. I would edit general articles, some of the fiction they got in, and I would write some.
You did write some
articles.
material.
Yeah, I did some, filler stuff for them, all of that.
Writing and editing, did you get into any of the layout and that sort of thing?
No,
Just,
no.
just the editing?
Not at that time.
And I
no.
don't mean just as a demeanor there.
Yeah.
So you actually then, before you sold your first professional piece of work, had a pretty good background to prepare you for writing.
As far as science fiction went, yeah, I took, my degree was in physics, but my minor was in anthropology, and most of my
It's an unusual combination.
most of my fiction was resulted from the anthropological end of things. I should say that when I was in graduate school in journalism, I was also managing editor of Bill Hamling's Rogue magazine. And eventually I came back after Science Digest. I worked there for 3 years. They moved to New York, Hearst bought them. And then I went back full time on Rogue as editor of Rogue.
You brought quite a few science fiction people in there with occasional pieces of pretty decent little science fiction story.
What isn't really realized is that both Rogue and Playboy came out of Evanston and Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
In the first year, Playboy reprinted some of the science fiction from Imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Both Hefner and Hamling had worked on the same magazines together and knew each other quite
yes,
well.
Right.
Later on, when Hefner hired Ray, oh God, I forget who was the managing editor of Lord Sardonicus.
Ray Russell.
Ray Russell. And Ray was a science fiction buff, printed a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, another editor-in-chief who succeeded Ray was also a science fiction buff and printed a lot of it in Playboy. And of course, reprinted all we could get in Rogue. Harlan Ellison was on staff. We printed a lot of Harlan stuff. We had Block. We had Bob Block and Alfie Bester as columnists.
Mm-hmm.
We printed Mac Reynolds. We printed travel articles by Mac Reynolds. We even put out a special science fiction issue.
Yes. Just as a sidebar, sort of, how were they paid by Rogue by comparison with what they were getting in the science fiction? in regular science fiction magazine?
Rogue, by comparison, Rogue paid pretty well. Rogue would pay $250, $300, which would amount to if I were to do a short story, 5,000 words for Astounding, that would have been $100. If I'd sold it to Rogue, it would have been $250.
So,
On the other hand, if I'd sold it to Playboy, it would have been $1,000.
yes, right. But Rogue was definitely a better market financially than the science fiction magazine. I think this is something that in our history we have to keep stressing all the time, is the idea that the pulp fiction field was not a very remunerative one unless you could really crank out the material.
Well, something else that I don't know how many people are aware of. The people who started in science fiction, either as writers and especially fans, later on became the editors for small presses. They also became the editors of general magazines. And a lot of science fiction appeared in general magazines purely because of what was a fan influence, even though the person may not have been a dyed-in-the-wool fan per se.
That's right.
Ray Russell never put out a fanzine, but he was certainly a science fiction fan.
I'd like to go back to something a name you've brought up several times here. Bill Hamlin's name is pretty well known by a lot of people. Sometimes well and sometimes not so well. And you mentioned the split when he left. Would you mind just sort of talking a little bit about that? I don't mean to his detriment necessarily, but just an idea of what happened, why he left, when he left.
Why he left where?
Well, you mentioned that he had left in
Ziff Davis?
Yeah.
Okay.
Something about he was with Palmer and then later he wasn't.
Oh, yeah. Palmer hired Bill, and Bill pretty much ran Mammoth Western and Fantastic Adventures. Palmer handled Amazing, and Howard Brown handled the mystery books.
Yes.
Later on, Ziff Davis moved to New York. Howard was willing to go along. Bill was not. Bill's roots were back here. Palmer had left some months before. Palmer had started Fate on his lunch hour. Literally, he went around the corner to his own offices where he was publishing Fate, and also started a science fiction magazine called Other Worlds. In preparation for Hamlin leaving, Hamlin took what money he had and started Imagination, and got Ray to front it for the first issue. Ray's name appeared on the first issue, but it was really Bill Hamlin's magazine.
Well, now there were some other pseudonyms involved in that transition too, were there not?
Probably Charles Recour, R-E-C-O-U-R, which was a pen name of Bill's.
Somewhere along, though, in that series of Imagination, Other Worlds, etc.
Science stories, etc., yeah.
Weren't they?
Universe was also Ray Palmer,
Right, okay.
under a pseudonym.
Right, yeah. Okay.
But Universe was a completely different cup of tea than Other Worlds.
Yes.
Universe, the initial issues were Ray's own attempts to go highbrow, without much luck. Universe ran for something like 9 issues and just never really made it.
Well, Universe came out on slightly better paper. And,
it was slightly better paper, more money was made. It was a more considerate stab made at the adult market.
All right. I don't want to get away from your fannish activities, because you've been a well-known fan for so many years. But let's talk a little bit about, or I'll listen to you talk about some of your earliest writing. After you sold this $5 idea for a poem, you became a professional writer and developed into one of the best in the field. Would you like to talk a little bit about the beginnings of that?
Well, it's I had pretty much separated from science fiction fandom once I started in college. I mean, that was there was not much fanning going on. In the summers, I was trying to be a writer, and Oliver Surrey, who was a don't mean to his detriment or anything. He was a little known writer of the period, but a great and good friend of mine, and Ollie taught me most of what I knew about writing. Mm-hmm. And that one summer, I took a short story and worked it over under Ollie's tutelage. I must have rewritten that story about 8 times. At the end of it, I don't know what, it's as sharp a line as stepping over a crack in a sidewalk. The difference between being an amateur writer and a professional. It's once over that line, once you make that step, everything falls into place. Mm-hmm. You know how to handle character, dialogue, suspense. You know all of that. Mm-hmm. And it's not that somebody spelled it out for you. It's that somehow the accretion of knowledge eventually created the pearl. And the other writers I've talked to, the same has been the case for them as well. They step over that line and they're a professional writer. A good example of somebody who flirted with the line but never completely stepped over it was Walt Liebscher. And in Rogue, we published his first and I think only really professional short story, Mama Hates Green. Mm-hmm. But it never worked quite the same for Walt. Walt was always involved in the amateur aspects, and I don't mean that as a put-down.
It can't be, because Walt was such a wonderful guy, and he provided so much pleasure for fans
for everybody who knew
him. Right.
But you have to have a certain kind of mind, and it's not a dilettante mind. It's a very hard set mind.
This, I think, is the difference. You take a Harlan Ellison; he's driven to become a writer, and he has to write.
Yeah.
Walt played.
Walt played as writer.
He was a dilettante.
He enjoyed it tremendously.
That's right. He would enjoy so much more doing the Spoonerisms that he did so beautifully.
Right.
Than to polish something up and sell it to somebody.
He used to drive me to distraction, because I would always be the serious person there trying to get Walt to be more serious about his writing, etc. And Walt was not about to be. But on the other hand, you have Wilson Tucker, who became a very good writer primarily in the mystery field. Mm-hmm. Although I'm not putting down his science fiction, but he wrote a very, very peculiar science fiction that nobody else has quite matched.
That's right. He had sort of a variant style as far as science fiction.
Yeah, completely variant style. He was not one for rocket ships and aliens at all.
Yeah.
But for myself, I was driven, and I went along 2 lines at the same time. And one was a mystery and the other was science fiction. And in most of my stories, I combined the two. And it was purely, those are the 2 threads.
Well, you did such a beautiful job of that in The Power. A lot of people these days don't even remember The Power, either in the book or the film made from it. For the record, would you like to talk a little bit about what happened in the development of The Power, the publication, and the movie?
Wow. Well, I was always fascinated by, and still am, by the idea of a Superman. We assume that we're the end point in evolution rather than merely a stop along the way. And that sooner or later we're going to be superseded by something, God knows what. But in the Power, the genesis of it was it was actually a put-down line, but I didn't look at it that way. And the line is, "It takes one to know one," and that's the whole idea of the Superman. It would. To recognize a fellow Superman, you'd have to be one yourself. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about that. And I toyed with the idea, what could he do? What would he do? What if you didn't know that you yourself were superhuman, you would be fair game for somebody who would like to be the one and only. And that's essentially the story, plus a pickup from a movie called The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer, where there's it's called the jump rope rhyme. And the jump rope rhyme is, you remind me of a man, what man, the man with the power, what power, the power of who do, you do what, remind me of a man, etc. And that was the introduction to the book. It was a mystery book. Who had the power? It was no rocket ships, no aliens. It was strictly a suspense story and a chase story, of which I was very fond. And I sent it off to the agent, and the agent sold it to Blue Book, which was 2 or 3 or 4 steps above local, science fiction magazine.
Both in terms of status and probably in money.
The funny part of that is when I went to mail the manuscript, I had kept it secret from Bill Hamlin, and Bill saw me at the post office and knew that I'd mailed a novel off
to somebody else.
To somebody else, right. He never, I don't think he ever quite forgave me for it. But it came out in Blue Book, and then bowdlerized, a condensed version. Then Lippincott published it, and it ran into 3 editions actually, and then Bantam picked it up, and then it sold about, God, there were 6 or 7 people who had taken, 6 or 7 people who had taken movie options on it.
Oh.
Including one little-known screenwriter of the period named Francis Ford Coppola, who could never quite afford to, pull down the full price.
Could never pull a package together.
Right,
yeah.
much to my later regret.
Yes.
But then one day I was working at Rogue, and I got a phone call, and it was this guy with a Hungarian accent at the other end of the line, and saying something that I was his favorite writer, etc. And I wanted to know, who's this yo-yo? And it turns out to be George Pell and Charlie Beaumont, who had done some work for Pell, had recommended the novel to him.
Oh.
And later on, Pell did indeed make the movie, one that did not delight me, threw away the ending. But that was the only thing that was being made on the MGM lot. MGM was in a stock option battle. Oh. They were busily filming The Power. They were doing Dr. Kildare with Richard Chamberlain, who later on played a role in The Towering Inferno. And then they were filming something known as Kubrick's Folly overseas, and that was 2001.
Yeah, right.
And so that's my claim to fame. I was made at the same time, so to speak. Yeah.
Well, I have one other thing that I'd like to get in before we finish this up, and not to touch a sore spot, but to, maybe it's not a sore spot, but the story has been passed about that you wrote no science fiction. You wrote very little, as a matter of fact, for a good number of years, following a rather scathing attack by somebody you thought of as a friend, Damon Knight. Is there truth in this story?
Yes and no. And yes, it is, to this day, remains something, it's a minor sore point. The truth is that Damon's review, which was quite scathing, really flabbergasted me, because I thought that I'd done a goodie, and that my fellow peers, etc., would pat me on the back and say, "Well done," etc. And a number of them did.
Most of them did.
Damon did not. And it was my first introduction to the fact that if you're going to be a writer, you better develop a thick skin. Damon accused me of being anti-science, which really hurt, because that was my degree, and I thought the world of both science and scientists. I mean, after all, at one time, that was what I intended to become.
Life.
Right. It is a little bit more accurate, though, to be honest, to be perfectly honest, as much as I was hurt by Damon's criticism, I had always been torn between being a writer and being an editor. And being an editor always seemed a little bit more secure.
Without a doubt.
And I also, the power of creation. I have a thing about magazines. I collect old magazines, as you know. I am fond of magazines. I'm very fond of magazine journalism. And to be offered the chance to be an editor of a magazine was overwhelming. And I would have to pick between being an editor or being a writer. It was very difficult to be both at the same time. Freddie Paul has been faced with the same problem throughout life.
That's right.
He was very good at both. And in retrospect, I really wish that I'd stuck to the writing, because it was writing that was the most permanent, and it was writing that would have been the most remunerative, and it was writing in the long run that would have been the most rewarding. What few people realize, the most fascinating business in the whole world is making movies. I mean, there's no doubt whatsoever about that.
Yeah.
A movie is a combination of a lot of different talents, and most of the people, even in bad movies, most of the people involved are really incredibly talented for what they do. A writer, an independent writer, has one up on a movie, because when I do a book, when I write a book, I am the set designer, I am the dialogue coach, I am the director, I am the producer, I am the actors, I am the whole ball of wax. It is like the latest book that came out, The Dark Beyond the Stars. That is my movie. It has everything in it, including special effects. It has the dialogue, it has the characters, it is everything that I've wanted. And recently I've had to talk about making that into a film. There was some minor interest. And right away, you're in compromise alley, because we can't do this and we can't do that. And don't you think you should combine characters? There's too many women in it. Don't you think we should cut down the cast? All of this, to the extent where if it's ever made in a movie, it would be financially remunerative, but it's certainly not going to be my book any more than The Dark.
Movies are made by committees.
Yeah, any more than The Power, the movie, was the book.
Well, one of the reasons why I personally have been concerned about the fact that you went the editorial route rather than the writing route for such a long time, most of that time at any rate, was sharpened when I read The Dark Beyond the Stars, because it just seemed such a shame that a talent that could produce that book had just sort of lain fallow for a long time.
Well, the only thing I can say to that, Rusty, is I'm not dead yet, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
But
as I said to you before,
yeah,
I want you to
yeah.
stick around so you can do some more like that.
Yeah, I would dearly love to, because there was a major complaint that I have here. Recently, Science Fiction Writers of America changed the name to the Science Fiction Writers in Fantasy.
There's a lot of fellow complainers about that.
And I have nothing against fantasy, but the most it's capable of doing is giving you a couple of hours of entertainment.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
What did I learn from fantasy? I learned that small people have hairy feet, and beware of giants.
Right, yeah.
And I got both lessons very well very early on. But fantasy is never going to change the world, and science fiction can. And in many respects,
Has the
science fiction
potential
already
at least,
has.
Right. Oh, yes.
And it has tremendous potential for doing so in the future. Science fiction has something to say, and fantasy doesn't, any more than horror does.
That's right. And
It's entertainment, and I don't put down the practitioners of it. But I'm sorry, science fiction is a higher calling.
Hey, I agree. But what do we know?
Yeah, you're right.
But thanks, Frank. I think you filled in some holes that will be useful to people down the pike in the future, because the only way we get some of this stuff is to get it down in words while people are still around to say it.
Yeah, there's the other thing that occurs to me is that there's a danger that all the players in the game will be somewhat larger than life. And the fact of the matter is that all of us, from Asimov to Heinlein to Hamlin to Palmer, myself, you, all of us are really very human beings.
That's part of the whole
Right.
name of the game. That we're just people and we like each other.
Yeah,
We work on the common idea.
that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's great.
All right. I don't know if I told you anything you didn't know. But
Not much that I didn't know, but we wanted to get it on the record.
yeah.
And